What is slavery? For much of history, slavery has been a fundamental piece in both the economy of the United States and various countries around the world. However, with the ideals of freedom that began to emerge from the mid-19th century, humanity realized that in order to advance as a society, it was necessary to set it aside. The American Civil War may be a perfect chapter to understand this transition. Are you interested in knowing the causes, development, and consequences of this important episode in American history? All right, then stay until the end of the video. As always, let's go back to the background. The young American nation was still defining both the borders of its states and its internal politics by the mid-19th century. One of the main topics of debate was slavery, which was abolished in most northern states, in contrast to the southern states. With the acquisition of new territories after the war with Mexico, the Compromise of 1850 was signed, in which an agreement was reached on the status that the acquired territories should receive and the way they would be divided. Of course, territorial disputes were not long in coming. This was followed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, two states that broke away from the old Louisiana purchased from Napoleon, where there were violent disputes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. As you can imagine, this also generated more tensions between the North and South, which supported the newly created states according to the ideology they were adopting. Finally, we arrive at 1860. During the United States presidential elections, a controversial figure is elected, the remembered Abraham Lincoln from the Republican Party, whose most significant proposal was the prohibition of slavery in all territories of the United States. This would be seen by the southern states as a violation of the Constitution. In addition to this, there were also economic and cultural causes. The North, richer and more industrialized, sought to adopt more protectionist measures that harmed the South, which was more rural and whose economy, based on cotton exploitation, largely depended on exports to Europe. Without large machinery, the South largely depended on slave labor. For this reason, before Lincoln took power, 7 southern states declared secession, forming the Confederacy with the Republican Jefferson Davis as leader. These were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Despite Lincoln's attempts to avoid escalating tensions, the Confederates insisted on secession, claiming it was legal under the Constitution, and even offering to buy federal properties and sign a peace treaty. However, these negotiations failed. With this, the Confederates began to take certain federal fortresses in the territories they claimed as their own, hopeful for European support with whom they were linked with the cotton business. Although, of course, these countries never intervened nor recognized the Confederate States as an independent country. Anyway, the point is that one of these forts, Fort Sumter in South Carolina, was operated by military personnel loyal to the ideals of the Union. So it would end up being the scene of the Battle of Fort Sumter, in which the Confederates managed to take it by force after a bombardment. Although the casualties were negligible, this was the trigger that sparked the beginning of the Civil War. With the start of the war, 4 new states joined the Confederacy: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. It's important to note that there were other states where slavery was still in effect, but they remained in the Union. These were Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland. On the other hand, some states changed their alignments during the course of the war. During the war, there were over 10,000 military confrontations, almost half of which took place in the territories of Tennessee and Virginia. In order to reward this recently adhered state, the Confederates moved the capital to Richmond, a serious strategic mistake, as this city was in a very vulnerable position due to its proximity to Washington District of Columbia. The first major land battle of this war was the First Battle of Bull Run, which took place in Manassas, Northern Virginia, where Union troops tried to advance towards the Confederate capital, Richmond, with the aim of capturing it and ending the war as soon as possible. However, the Confederates were able to resist, forcing the Unionists to return to Washington thanks to the action of Thomas Jonathan Jackson. One of the first tactics of the Union Armed Forces, led by Winfield Scott, was the Anaconda Plan, based on the naval blockade of the ports to suffocate their economy, which was based on the cotton trade with European countries. For their part, the Confederates, having no navy, had to improvise a fleet with armed merchant ships. This maritime campaign highlights the Battle of Hampton Roads, off the coast of Virginia, because despite being considered a Confederate tactical victory and a Union strategic victory, it is remembered as the first naval battle between two armored ships, later known as battleships. In the long run, the Union was able to maintain the naval blockade. On land, Union efforts continued in what was known as the Peninsula Campaign, with new attempts to capture the capital Richmond from March 1862. This campaign turned out unfavorable for them, as they had to withdraw by July despite their numerical and military superiority. The next stage of this front would be the Northern Virginia Campaign, between July and September 1862, which concluded with another victory for the Confederacy, this time led by General Robert Edward Lee. With this, the Confederate troops head towards Washington to take the capital, but are stopped at the Battle of Antietam, where the Union troops doubled the number of the Confederates. This was the bloodiest day of the war, with over 22,000 casualties in a single day. 5 days after this battle, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which changes the legal status of over 3.5 million African Americans, from slaves to free men in the Southern territories. That is, if they crossed into Union territory, they automatically gained their freedom. Despite this affront, the Confederates continued with more victories in Fredericksburg. It's important to note that simultaneously with the Eastern Front in Virginia, there was also a lesser-scale war on the Mississippi Front, where the Confederates weren't as lucky and the Unionists gained full control of the eastern region by 1863. Here the participation of General Ulysses Grant stands out. And speaking of 1863, this is when things start to change. After the Confederates under Lee achieve a Pyrrhic victory at Chancellorsville, in which the remembered Stonewall Jackson accidentally dies, spirits rise to attempt a new invasion to the north, this time reaching as far as the state of Pennsylvania. Here, their troops meet with the Unionists in the village of Gettysburg, where the bloodiest battle of the war takes place, with over 50,000 casualties on both sides, and which meant a disastrous defeat for Lee and the turning point of the war. From here, the tables turn in favor of the Union, who, having already closed the Mississippi front, now begin to put all their effort in the east. In addition to this, the naval blockade from the Anaconda Plan was already beginning to see its effects, given that the South, already with fewer resources and troops, was running out of supplies. From 1864, General Grant, who was on the Western Front, is appointed by Lincoln as commander of all the armies. Grant had the idea of a total war in which they would seek victory after the complete destruction of the Confederate forces, as well as their resources and economy. With this, he devised a strategy to attack from numerous fronts, putting different generals in command. Despite having heavy casualties in attrition battles like in Wilderness, Cold Harbor, in each encounter they forced the Confederates to retreat a little more. Finally, they would end up surrounding Lee's army during the Petersburg, Virginia campaign, which was the last campaign and was based on a tough trench warfare for 9 months. Alongside this campaign, other generals sent by Grant were determined to attack various points in the South, among which stands out the March to the Sea by the troops of General William Sherman, who departed from his front in Tennessee, advancing to the state of Georgia. Here he destroyed everything in his path: industries, railways, warehouses, and even 20% of the state's farms. With the capture of Atlanta and victories in Petersburg and other points, the morale of the Union was at its highest, which earned Lincoln re-election in 1864. On the other hand, the Confederate troops were dwindling due to casualties and desertions. This declining army would receive a harsh blow in the Battle of Five Forks, very close to the capital, Richmond. This defeat meant the retreat of General Lee, whose final blow would be given the next day in the Third Battle of Petersburg, which would mean the end of this campaign with the capture of Richmond and the consequent Confederate surrender. This victory would barely be celebrated by Lincoln, as a few days after the victory arrived, he would be assassinated by a sympathizer from the South. This closes one of the darkest episodes in United States history, which resulted in a total of 617,000 deaths, even more than in both World Wars. After the Confederate defeat, the territories were reincorporated into the United States and divided into 5 military districts. This occupation would last until 1870. To this day, there are certain revisionists who try to dismiss slavery as the underlying cause of this war, a fact that leaves Lincoln as the hero and the Confederation as the villain of the story. Likewise, emphasis is always placed on the obvious numerical, military, and technological disadvantage of the South, which suggests that the results of this war were foreseen even before its start. What do you think? Do you believe that the Southern revisionists are right in saying that this war was more for economic reasons than for ideals of freedom? Don't forget to leave your comment, and if you like this video, support me with a like and subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on my social networks, and if you're interested in supporting this project, any donation on Patreon will be welcome. See you next time.